Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. What a year it's been. From the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, elections in India and America, dictators ousted in Syria and even Bangladesh, we've covered it all here at FP Live. But I wanted to take a step back today and look at some of the bigger picture trends. At the end of every year, it's become an FP tradition to invite one big thinker to join us for a twofer, looking back and then gazing ahead. This one is the first of those two episodes. News moves quickly these days, so I should make clear we are taping on Tuesday, December the 17th. Joining me now is Fareed Zakaria. In 2020, FP named him among its top 10 global thinkers of the last decade for his books, columns, and his show. And he joins us now. Fareed, welcome back.
Pleasure to be with you, Ravi.
So as we look back at 2024, I think we have to start with the US elections. And Fareed, I'm imagining you feel like you predicted some of what happened. Your book, Age of Revolutions, was all about how societies everywhere are primed for a backlash. And maybe that's at least part of why Harris lost and why Trump won. What did you make of it?
Yeah, it's very kind of you to say that. But yeah, I do think that one of the things I was trying to get across in the book was that the rise of this kind of populism and the degree of anxiety and even anger, rage in the body politic, particularly in the West, was not a momentary spasm. This was part of a much broader, deeper backlash that we were going to be living with for years, if not decades. So I think that is one very important reality that Trump's election provided, the world, which is this is not going away. This was not 2016 was not a fluke. This is, part of the landscape of politics we have to deal with. And, relatedly, the old Republican Party is gone. There is now only a populist MAGA Republican Party. I do think the big takeaway, beyond that kind of very broad trend, is the degree to which this was an anti-incumbency year and an anti-incumbent year. You've probably seen the same data I have that John Byrne Murdoch at the FT put together very well. But in the last 15 months, 16 months, every incumbent government that faced election suffered an incumbent penalty. So much so that, think of the British Tories. They go from their biggest margin of victory since Margaret Thatcher to their biggest margin of defeat in their 200-year existence. They now have the smallest minority that they've ever had. Look at the LDP in Japan, which basically has won every election since 1948, with one exception, and they lost. Look at, obviously, the United States. The one exception here is India, and we can get to that in a minute, but Modi suffered an incumbent penalty, but stayed in power. And why is that? Part of it is the turmoil, the change, people feeling like in the midst of all this, kind of world revolutionary sense of unease and anxiety, throw the bombs out. Whatever's happening now isn't working. And I think in some ways, somebody has called it the second COVID election, which is, I think, a nice way to think about it, which is that all this was dramatically exacerbated by COVID and the inflation that came out of COVID, the supply chain disruptions, the work disruption, stay at home, don't stay at home, all that led to a greater degree of a sense of like, whatever's happening now is not working.
Mm. And there's South Africa as well, countries like Mexico,
Right.
Taiwan, where incumbents came back or incumbent parties came back, but weakened. Does this all make you think, Fareed, that democracy in some senses is in better shape than we had expected it to be in 2024?
Well, it's funny you put it very well, Ravi, because most people's reaction is democracy is in terrible shape. And there is something to the idea that we are in a crisis of democratic institutions. People do feel that democratic institutions are not delivering for them, but they are using democracy to solve that problem. And in a way, this shows you democracy's greatest strength, which is in moments of great anxiety, great turmoil, there is this amazing escape valve called an election. And you can throw the bombs out, you can change the government, and you're going to get something different. And you can then decide whether that, was what you wanted or what you didn't want. But I think that that is what you don't have in Iran, in Russia, in China, in Venezuela, which makes those regimes ultimately much more brittle than we realize, as we saw with Syria, where at the end of the day, particularly a personalistic dictatorship, unlike, say, the Chinese who have an institutionalized dictatorship, those regimes tend to be quite fragile.
Hmm. So let's get to the Middle East then. I'm curious how you rate the Biden administration's foreign policy there. I mean, for me, it feels like a little bit of a mixed picture because America's clearly lost a lot of soft power by being seen as complicit in Israel's war in Gaza. But then over the last few months, where you imagine that Washington looks at how weakened Iran is, how Hezbollah is decimated, how the Assad family has fled Syria, and those are actually positive outcomes for the United States, at least.
Yeah, I think you put it right, which is to separate the issue of Gaza from the rest. On the issue of Gaza, the US is always going to pay a price for supporting Israel and for supporting particularly Bibi Netanyahu's war in Gaza, which is, what many Israelis believe, unnecessarily protracted, unnecessarily broad brush, unnecessarily cruel to ordinary civilians in Gaza. But put that aside, because honestly, that does not have a great uh, significance in the regional balance of power. That is more fundamentally, has always been to me a kind of issue of of morality, and Israel has all the power in this situation. The question is, what does it want to do with the occupied territories? What does it want to do with the 5 million Palestinians who live under its rule? But if you, as I say, separate these two fronts, on the northern front, what has happened has been nothing short of miraculous, incredibly positive developments for both Israel and the United States. Basically, what you had in the Middle East was an American-led security order that was largely to the benefit of America, the moderate Arab states, the Gulf states in particular. The great source of opposition to it was the Iranian regime. And the Iranians, actually not very strong, used a very ingenious method of asymmetrical power, which is allying themselves and supporting and funding a series of militias, sub-state actors, from the Houthis in Yemen to the militias in Iraq and Syria, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course to Hamas in Gaza. What the Israelis decided to do, and this is interesting how history works, it seems as though it was almost accidental, because they realized their pagers were being discovered by Hezbollah. And so they decided, let's unleash the northern strategy that we had always thought we might use. And it succeeded beyond their wildest imaginations. They were able to completely destroy Hezbollah's communications, then Hezbollah's command structure, then Hezbollah's weapons caches, with no real pushback. Then they went further and destroyed all of Iran's air defenses. That in turn meant that the two great props of the Assad regime, Hezbollah and Iran, substantially weakened. Russia distracted by Ukraine. Syria collapses. The Israelis then go destroy the Syrian navy, destroy the Syrian air defenses, and occupy the part of Syria next to the Golan Heights, so they have an even more commanding position. What this means is that the axis of resistance has basically been blown up. You still have parts of it, obviously, the Houthis in Yemen, but it's massively weakened. Iran has been massively weakened. Hezbollah is a shell of itself. It still exists as a very powerful political player in Lebanon. But the whole challenge to the American-led security order has largely collapsed. And we have to see where that goes. As we know, in the Middle East, weakness can be as complicated and produce as much instability as strength. But for now, you are seeing a reordering of the Middle East, with Israel as the undisputed military superpower, and with the American-led security system in much better shape than it's been for a decade.